दूसरा लग नहीं है I'm gonna, hello. Hi everyone, and welcome to this Thursday evening seminar. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Darren Knobel and to introduce him. So Professor Knobel is currently the Professor of Epidemiology and Population Health and the Director of the Center for Conservation Medicine and Ecosystem Health at the Ross University School of Veterinary Medicine on the island of St. Kitts in the Caribbean. Incidentally, I had gotten in touch with Darren when he was at the University of Pretoria in South Africa, when I thought I would be going there to work in South Africa because he's got a large South African program. He's South African by birth and by citizenship. And he was just in the process of moving halfway across the world to the Caribbean island of St. Kitts. So I said, oh, why not? Let me continue this relationship, and I get to go to both South Africa and St. Kitts. So that, hopefully next year I'll get to visit him in St. Kitts. But Darren studies rabies in dogs. That's one of his main sort of main interests. And ironically, he's moved to a place that has no rabies. Therefore, he has to now travel back to South Africa to do most of his research. So Darren received his PhD from the University of Edinburgh, and then he did a postdoc at the University of Glasgow, working with the leading researchers in the field of rabies. Today, he's going to talk to us about dog population ecology and how that can help in efforts to reduce the burden of human rabies.
Thank you very much, Dr. Abi, for the introduction and for the invitation to come and visit. This is only my second trip to India. The first trip was more than nearly 15 years ago to Orissa province, and it was only for a couple of days. It was to talk about rabies, so it's really nice to kind of come back and be able to spend a bit of time and really understand the context of rabies in India. And I gave quite a bit of thought of what to try and speak about today to an audience from multiple different disciplines. And I thought I'd try and focus a little bit on dog population ecology and how a better understanding of dog population ecology might help us reach the goal of eliminating human deaths from rabies by 2030. But this is very much ideas that are based on my own experiences, which are largely from Africa, where the context is different, although there probably are enough similarities to hopefully make the lessons learned there worthwhile to hear. And one of the things that kind of strikes me about the rabies situation and dog rabies in India in general is how populations are managed here. I don't think we necessarily see that in a lot of other places, this big focus on animal birth control programs. So I am going to focus a little bit on that, but again, this is largely from my own perspective. And so it led me to think about the question of, why do we manage dog populations? Why do we want to manage dog populations? And I think there's really two main reasons, and that's we want to improve dog welfare, but we also want to reduce public health risks associated with dogs. So if we think about each of these components a little bit more carefully, it might provide us with a framework where we can look at different management techniques and perhaps look at their effects on these different aspects. So in terms of improving dog welfare, what do we want to do? We want to reduce deaths, and we want to reduce illness or disability or disease in the population. As far as reducing public health risk, I focused on the two main ones here, and that's reducing the risk of dog bites, as well as reducing the risk of rabies, which is my primary interest, but there's a lot of overlap in these other areas as well. And when we think of reducing the risk of rabies, we really want to reduce the risk of dog bites, as well as the prevalence of dog rabies, because the transmission of rabies or the risk of rabies is largely a function of those two variables, risk of dog bites and the amount of rabies present in the dog population. So I'm not going to spend too much time on dog welfare, but I will come back to it towards the end of the talk. But I thought it would be useful to just try and think a little bit more rigorously about what we want to do in terms of improving dog welfare, and can we move to a more standardized kind of framework. And there has been some recent work on this that it's maybe worth just touching on. So when we talk about reducing deaths, we don't want to make dogs immortal. What we're really talking about is reducing premature deaths from particular causes that we may have some control over, as well as reducing a state of compromised welfare. And this leads to quite strong parallels to looking at burden of disease in humans, and the metric that we use there called the disability adjusted life year. And another group has done some work on this, moving towards a framework where we can consider welfare adjusted life years, which are a combination of dog time, in this case dog days maybe, or dog weeks, dog months, dog years, whatever scale you want to measure it on, dog days lost to premature death, as well as dog days lived with impaired welfare. So for any particular cause of welfare concern, your welfare adjusted life year is then your dog days lost to premature death due to that cause, plus your dog days lived with impaired welfare due to that cause. And this is the reference to the paper where those ideas come from. But it takes a very well-established metric in human public health and suggests that we apply it to animal welfare. And I think it is quite a useful framework to start thinking about these questions in a more standardized way, because it'll lend itself to more standardized measures of cost effectiveness of different interventions if we are able to measure their effects on a similar scale. And similarly, we can also think about, instead of thinking about the prevalence of rabies, we can think about the number of rabid dog days. And if we think that if on average one dog is infectious for each day over a 3-year period, then for that period, the total number of rabid dog days is 1 times 3 times 365. So 1,095 rabid dog days. It's just another way of thinking about prevalence over time, and helping us to get on a similar scale so that we can actually maybe start to think about, all right, if we have a particular intervention that maybe affects rabid dog days as well as the welfare adjusted life year, we can start to measure these things on a similar scale. So this was just to help me more than anything else to kind of come up with a bit of a framework to consider these questions around dog population management. And there's really two main tools, I think, for dog population management, and that is obviously dog vaccination, which really affects this measure here, the number of rabid dog days. That's really what we're trying to reduce through dog vaccination. And then the other major component of dog population management programs is animal birth control. And at the moment, there's a real focus on surgical sterilization. So completely removing the capacity for reproduction permanently through a surgical operation. But I think it's also worth keeping in mind that there are tools that are, my prediction is these tools will become available within the next 5 years that might lead to a temporary state of contraception that is not permanent, but that can be more easily applied than surgical sterilization. And I'm talking about injectable contraceptives like immunocontraceptives that are based on inducing an immune response to either, say, the gonadotropin-releasing hormone or some other component of the reproductive system, and thereby temporarily removing the capacity for reproduction. And again, the advantages of these technologies would be their ease of use. They would be deliverable by means of an injection, so similar to vaccination. So I think it's worth keeping those in mind, that when we talk about animal birth control programs, it's not just surgical sterilization. Let's keep in mind the potential for these injectable contraceptives over the next 5 years or so becoming available. Okay, so this kind of sets the framework, and then really thinking about the potential impact, at least theoretically, of these animal birth control programs. I think we often assume they have these effects, but it's worth kind of dissecting out whether, what are the factors at play. So animal birth control is often promoted as an adjunct to dog vaccination to reduce the risk of rabies. It's often promoted in order to reduce risk of dog bites, and it's certainly often promoted in order to improve dog welfare. And theoretically, it can do all of these things, but I think it's worth just examining some of the underlying assumptions as to whether or not it does these things in the real world. And I think certainly the intervention that I've thought most about is that of dog vaccination. And so I'm going to use that as an entry point in thinking about the impact of, or the potential utility of animal birth control in some of these other factors as well. So the case for dog vaccination. It's worth just spending a little bit of time on the theory, which is based on the phenomenon known as herd immunity. So control of any infectious disease in a population through vaccination relies on this phenomenon of herd immunity. We try and achieve a certain level of immunity in the population that reduces the spread of an infectious disease in that population. And the phenomenon of herd immunity is powerful in that it allows us to control or even eliminate diseases through vaccination without requiring us to vaccinate 100% of the population. So herd immunity is defined as a population-level phenomenon whereby immunity to an infectious disease in a proportion of the population substantially reduces the spread of disease among the non-immune proportion. And that then leads us to the question of what proportion of the population actually needs to be immune in order to achieve this threshold of herd immunity. And there's an equation that says herd immunity, that level is achieved if the proportion of individuals immune exceeds this number, 1 minus 1 over R naught. But keep in mind there are a number of assumptions based on which this equation is based. That is, vaccination is delivered at random. There's perfect immunity following vaccination. In other words, every dog vaccinated becomes immune. And you have a randomly mixing population. And those assumptions may be true or not true to a greater or lesser extent, depending on your particular circumstances. So it's worth just keeping those in mind. But for now, we'll just focus on this equation, 1 minus 1 over R naught. So what then is R naught? R naught is the basic reproductive number of an infection in a population. So it's essentially a measure of how infectious the disease is. If you take one infected animal and you put it into a population of an unlimited number of susceptible individuals, on average, and you repeated that experiment 100 or 1,000 times, R naught is the average number of secondary cases that one individual will then infect. So for example, for an R naught of 2, one infected individual in a population of susceptibles would on average infect 2 other individuals. And those 2 individuals would then be infectious they would each infect another 2, and so you'd get an exponential increase in your number of cases in the population, and you'd have an outbreak. And there's a magical threshold where R0 equals 1, because when R0 equals 1, on average, each case will only replace itself in the population. And as soon as R0 goes below 1, then on average, each individual infects less than one other individual, and your outbreak dies out. So this equation helps us to identify the threshold of immune individuals required to force that reproductive rate, the effective reproductive rate of the disease below that threshold of 1. So if we know R0, we can know this magical threshold of immunity. So what is R0 for rabies in dogs? And this work was taken from this graph is taken from the work of Dr. Katie Hampson, who published it. R0 for rabies is actually surprisingly low, 1.1 to 1.3, so quite close to that threshold of 1, making it quite amenable to elimination through vaccination. Again, keeping in mind these assumptions, and keeping in mind another assumption that there's no reintroduction into the population from other reservoirs, that only dogs are a reservoir in this case. So that low value of R0 is good news for us in terms of rabies control. And it's not just from this data. This data was from Tanzania, but Katie compiled data from a number of other studies that suggest R0 is typically around 1.2, 1.3, and very rarely, if ever, would it exceed 2. So it is low. So based on those estimates of the basic reproductive number, what then is the threshold for herd immunity? If we apply that equation without those assumptions, the critical threshold for immunity is 20 to 40%. In other words, if you can keep a proportion of your population immune at any point in time of at least 40%, you should reduce rabies outbreaks. You shouldn't see rabies outbreaks. You may still see isolated cases, but they don't go on to produce outbreaks. So let's look at the case of mass vaccination of dogs through annual vaccination campaigns. And this is really the kind of accepted method or recommended method of rabies control, is in dogs at least, is mass vaccination of dogs to try and keep the proportion of immune individuals above that critical threshold. But let's first consider the case of annual vaccination campaigns, but with inadequate coverage. And what happens here is you organize a vaccination campaign, but you only reach 50% of the population. You may think, well, good, that's above the critical threshold of 40%, so we've done okay. The problem is, as soon as the vaccination campaign ends, the proportion of immune individuals in the population starts to decrease through various factors that I'll discuss later. And so what you end up with is, over time, a decrease in the proportion of individuals immune, such that by the time you come back a year later, you've only got a vaccination coverage of 20%, which is well below our assumed critical threshold of 40%. You come back a year later and you vaccinate 50% of the dogs again. Maybe 20% are already vaccinated, so you really only boost it back up to 50%. You get it back up above that threshold, but the same thing happens again. You leave, the population herd immunity comes down below that critical threshold. And so this cycle kind of repeats itself. Every time you go back in and you don't hit an adequate target. So what happens with rabies cases then is, because the population herd immunity is below that critical threshold for such extended periods, you start to see rabies cases in the population. And maybe when you come back here and you vaccinate, you bring it under control, but then the same thing just happens again the following year. And you see these repeated outbreaks of rabies. So what really needs to happen is the target coverage achieved in those annual campaigns has to be sufficient to maintain coverage above the threshold for herd immunity in the period in between your vaccination campaigns. And the accepted value is 70%. There's good empirical evidence and there's good theoretical evidence that if you achieve 70% vaccination coverage of your population during an annual campaign, that will actually keep your threshold, your proportion of individuals immune above the critical threshold for at least 12 months. So that by the time you come back a year later, you can boost it back up and it hasn't gone below that critical threshold. And so you may see, at least initially, isolated cases, but because you're keeping that level of herd immunity above the critical threshold for long enough, those cases don't lead to outbreaks, and eventually the disease fades out and dies out in the area. And you may see sporadic cases from reintroductions, but if you can maintain coverage above that level, then those won't go on to cause major outbreaks. So this is really the kind of theory behind mass dog vaccination for the control of rabies in dogs. But you can imagine this is not an easy thing to achieve. It is achievable, but it takes a lot of resources, it takes a lot of effort. And experience in South Africa suggests that one of the biggest obstacles is just vaccinator fatigue, just getting your teams motivated to go out year in and year out and achieve 70% vaccination coverage, access all of those dogs. And depending on levels of accessibility in your population, 70% may not even be achievable. If you don't have enough easily catchable dogs, then your costs quickly go up as you try and access more and more dogs that are not easily maybe accessible or easy to handle. So that got me thinking about, is there anything we can maybe do to extend the period between vaccination campaigns? Instead of looking at annual vaccination campaigns, maybe look at biennial, so twice yearly vaccination campaigns. And even if this isn't your goal, the principles here will also apply if we're not able to achieve that 70% coverage, even in annual campaigns. Maybe our coverage is 50 or 60%. The principles I'm going to discuss may help in maintaining the level of herd immunity above that critical threshold for a one-year period. And there's two ways of doing this. One is to increase the vaccination coverage achieved during campaigns. So essentially shift that line upwards. Okay, so instead of 70% coverage, you're getting 82, 83% coverage. So that's one way of extending the period during which your herd immunity is above that critical threshold. The other way is to actually reduce that rate of decline of vaccination coverage between campaigns. So change the shape of that line so that the rate of decline decreases. And this is just a list of the things that I think affect that. If you wanted to model the rate of decline of vaccination coverage, this is what you need information on. Your population, age, and sex structure at the time of your vaccination campaign. Age and sex-specific vaccination coverage, because we know vaccination coverage isn't homogeneous. You need to look, if you're not assuming 100% immunity in vaccinated animals, your proportion immune, as well as your rate of loss of immunity. And this could be your rate of loss of vaccine-derived immunity, as well as your rate of loss of any maternal immunity. So you could include a model, or include in your model any puppies that are born to vaccinated dams would have maternal immunity. So a certain proportion of puppies might be born with maternal immunity, and also from discussions over the last couple of days, there might be natural immunity. So dogs that were exposed to a sublethal dose of rabies virus in a preceding outbreak might have natural immunity, and you could include this in your models as well. And then obviously a big component of that rate of decline is the birth of these susceptible puppies. So even puppies with maternal immunity, they'll usually lose them at 3 months. So a big component of this decline is the birth of susceptible puppies into your population. So your birth rate, which then is a function of your reproductive probability, so your litters per fertile female per year, what proportion of fertile females there are in your population, and that could be age-related, but it could also include a function for a certain proportion to be sterilized or contracepted. And then what is the size of those litters when they are born. And then you need to include age, sex, and maybe vaccination-specific mortality rates, if we assume that vaccinated and unvaccinated dogs die at different rates. And then age, sex, and vaccination-specific migration rates into and out of the population. And if you took all of those things together, you would be able to model that rate of decline of vaccination coverage. And there are a number of published studies in the literature which have these parameters. It's just a question of pulling them in together into some sort of compartmental model that, that would make sense. But let's just look at this qualitatively for now. I think let's consider the potential role of animal birth control programs in affecting that rate of decline of vaccination coverage. Obviously, the major parameter that would be affected is this proportion of fertile females. That's really what we're doing when we're doing these sterilization campaigns. We're reducing the proportion of fertile females in the population. But I think there's also some evidence that, particularly for these immunocontraceptive vaccines, that you might also reduce litter size. So even if you don't get 100% contraceptive effect, you might see a reduction in your litter size. So it's worth considering that in any of these models that look at the effect of birth control on decreasing the rate of decline of vaccination coverage. But I think the thing that we're missing, that we don't have a very good handle on, and I think it's really key to understanding the potential for sterilization or contraception programs as adjuncts for rabies control, is if we go in and we sterilize females or we reduce litter size, in other words, we decrease the birth rates, what effect is that going to have on these other parameters? Are we going to see a decrease in mortality rates? I think there's pretty good evidence to suggest that maybe the reproductive burden on females imposed by gestation, parturition, lactation contributes to their mortality. And I think this is why we see in a lot of cases male-skewed sex ratios in these populations. And I think it's because females have a higher mortality rate as a result of that reproductive burden. So if you remove that in a proportion of your females, are you going to see a compensatory increase in survival of those females that might actually dampen any effect of a reduction in birth rates, certainly on abundance? But that might actually be a good thing if your females that are surviving are vaccinated, as they may well be. If they've been sterilized, they've probably been vaccinated, so you get an increase in survival of your vaccinated females. So that may actually help to reduce the rate of decline of vaccination coverage, because increased survival of vaccinated individuals in your population is a good thing from that perspective. But then I think something we really need to consider is changes in migration rates. What happens if you reduce the birth rate below a certain level? Are we going to see changes in migration rates as a result of kind of feedback mechanisms that might be present in the system? So I think these are some of the parameters that we need to consider a little bit more carefully. So you may see a decrease in birth rate, a decrease in mortality rates, and an increase in migration rates. So there may be some sort of competing effects here that would be important to consider in these models. So these are the two main ways where I think animal birth control programs might be able to, at least theoretically, serve as an adjunct for rabies control. We might be able to increase vaccination coverage achieved during campaigns if animal birth control programs decrease abundance. So you can think about it, for example, if you have 100 dogs in an area, and in order to achieve 70% coverage, you'll need to vaccinate 70 of them. But if you can reduce abundance in that area to, say, 85, and you still go in and vaccinate 70 of them, that's going to give you a coverage of 82, 83%. So just by decreasing abundance, by applying the same effort in your vaccination campaigns and accessing the same number of dogs, you actually increase your vaccination coverage achieved during campaigns. But I think it's a big question as to whether these programs actually reduce abundance due to these compensatory changes, and also a big question around cost effectiveness. What would be more cost effective? Simply putting in the resources to catch more dogs to increase that coverage, or putting in the resources through animal birth control to reduce abundance so that you can catch the same number of dogs that would then result in a higher vaccination coverage. So I think we really need to consider these questions through the lens of cost effectiveness studies. And then I think the other way, maybe more feasibly, that animal birth control programs could act as adjuncts to rabies control is through reducing the rate of decline of vaccination coverage between campaigns, through a decrease in the birth rate and perhaps changes in mortality rates. Oh, excuse me. But I think we need to keep in mind this question of migration rates. What happens when we reduce abundance in an area, we maybe reduce the availability of puppies? Do we see a compensatory increase in migration that might offset any benefits of a decrease in birth rate? And again, I think we need to think about cost effectiveness. Is it really cost effective to reduce this, or would it simply be better to put our efforts into accessing and vaccinating more dogs? So one of the things I think we don't have a very good handle on is the question of carrying capacity. And I think that's quite a central question in trying to understand these compensatory changes. If you reduce birth rates, maybe if you reduce abundance, do you see compensatory changes depending on whether your population is above or below some sort of carrying capacity? And these are definitely questions that I think are better analyzed by people with ecological and particularly quantitative ecological skills. But I've had a bit of a go at thinking about it, at least. And the advantage we have in our situation in Africa is that dogs are owned. And this is just a list of some of the studies I pulled from the literature where people have tried quite hard to look for unowned dogs in that environment. And in the vast majority of cases, the proportion of unowned dogs, if any, is negligible. So we can really focus our efforts on owned dogs, both in terms of rabies control, but also in terms of understanding dog population ecology. And what we've noticed about these populations is that they're relatively stable over time. So this is a 2-year period where we studied a population of dogs in South Africa. And the population increased and then decreased. And actually, we've got data to show that it kind of bounced back. And so it hovers around a particular number. And Michelle Morters showed some data from 2 other areas in South Africa. And in fact, she had data from outside Africa in Bali, which showed very similar results in that these dog populations are not growing over time. They're actually quite stable, which does suggest some sort of carrying capacity and some sort of regulatory mechanism that is controlling those dog populations at that level. And so I think that helps us to try and think about this question of carrying capacity. And this is the area where our data came from. It's an area in South Africa, which, as you know, is at the southern tip of Africa. And our study site is in the northeastern corner of South Africa, just adjacent to the Kruger National Park and some of the surrounding wildlife reserves. Here it is here in a village called Hlubukani. And that village had around 2,000 households, and we mapped all of them out. And we can see in the gray or the white are the residential stands, which essentially act as resource patches for dogs. If we consider that the only dogs in that population are owned dogs, they belong to one of those households. And that really helps us to kind of address these questions. And we did do a questionnaire. I think we need to do a little bit more work to validate it and work around it, but just asking households whether they feel they have enough, too few, or too many dogs. And we asked this of a large sample of households in the area. And interestingly, a lot of households said they had too few dogs. And that was mainly in dogs that had, households that had no dogs. So of those 1,066 households that had no dogs, 43% of them said, we have too few dogs. In other words, we want dogs. And there may be other barriers to acquiring dogs. People may feel that they can't afford to look after them. But what we found is a big barrier is actually just availability of puppies. There aren't enough dogs to satisfy the demand for dogs, or at least not during the time that we looked at this questionnaire, when we did this questionnaire. And it's a relatively small proportion of households, and it was particularly these few households that had 3 or more dogs that felt that they had too many. But there wasn't a large number, a total number of households that felt they had too many dogs. So I think this technique might help us address this question of carrying capacity. That is, it's really set by human demand for dogs, and there may be other factors that address that affect that in turn, socioeconomic level, perceived level of crime, or whatever it may be, reasons why people want to have a dog or feel that they could have a dog in their household. But certainly in our area, there isn't the case of there being too many dogs, which does lead us to question the value of a birth control program in a scenario like that, where there maybe aren't enough dogs already. What are you going to do to that system by reducing the birth rate? Probably you're going to lead to in-migration, people acquiring dogs from outside of the area, and thereby actually increasing your risk of disease introduction into the area. So I think these are some of the things that we need to consider a little bit more carefully before we promote birth control programs, certainly in a situation like this. And again, the situation may be different in other populations. In other populations, there certainly may be too many dogs, but I think we need to test those assumptions before we act on them. I think the other thing that maybe mitigates the impact of any animal birth control program is what happens with puppies. And this is some data that we've just collected from a longitudinal study. And again, the fact that our dogs are owned lends itself to this. It's still hard work to get these kind of numbers. So we enrolled 88 female dogs into the study, and we kept tabs on them over time. And when they became pregnant, the owners would inform us, or we'd pick it up during our periodic visits, and then we'd try and access those dogs as soon as possible after they gave birth. And these 88 females gave birth to 137 litters. And then of those 137 litters, we followed them, those puppies, all the way through to day 140, which is about 5 months of age. And this is the data that we got. So by the time we kind of came for the day 0 visit, there were only 114 litters because in many cases the entire litter had died, or the owner we lost the owner to follow up. But in 114 litters, there were 706 puppies. First of all, that's actually quite a high litter size. That's about 6 puppies per litter, which is higher than what's reported in the literature. And I think it's because we were able to get to those puppies pretty soon, within a couple of days, within about 3 days of birth in most cases. And I think if you leave it any longer than that, you start to, the number of puppies that die in those intervening days is actually quite substantial. By the time we came back at 42 days, 231 of those puppies were already dead. At least 231 were already dead, and 112 had been lost to follow-up, given away, or owners just didn't know. So the number died is actually probably a minimum number. So 231 puppies dead. And then over time, the rate of death actually decreases. So these are the numbers based on the numbers of puppies that we know died. The puppy mortality rates from day 0 to 42, 1/3 of those puppies born will be dead by the time they're 6 weeks old. And if we assume that all of those puppies lost to follow-up died as well, that number goes up to 50%. So anywhere from a third to a half of puppies will be dead before they're 6 weeks old. And then that number goes up, although the rate of increase is a lot slower. By the time the puppies are 5 months old, at least half of them are dead. And if we include follow-ups in those deaths, that number goes up probably to around 2/3 of the puppies. So even without any birth control, the number of puppies that actually survive beyond 6 months is very low relative to the total number that are born. And so I think this again mitigates certainly cost effectiveness of birth control programs to manage populations. Puppies are probably, a large proportion of those puppies are not going to be recruited into the population anyway. And so I really think it's essential that we look at this through the lens of cost effectiveness. And this is a paper that we've recently submitted to PLOS neglected tropical diseases. and I've just taken some of the text out of that paper. And we really found that at least, so we used the data from our study area, which admittedly is a relatively small population of around 800 dogs in an area of around 10,000 people. And we modeled one of the scenarios where, in addition to vaccination, we added sterilization of any juvenile or adult female dog that was contacted during a vaccination. Showed that under no scenarios was this actually cost effective. Our results based on this dog population suggest that sterilization would not be an optimal strategy if the spatial extent of management is not large, and even if it was large, it may not be the case. And this is largely because of this issue of migration of dogs from outside areas. If you reduce birth rates, but there's still a demand for dogs, in other words, your population is below that carrying capacity, dogs are simply going to move into the area either on their own, or in our situation, people are going to bring them in to fulfill that demand. But I think this model could be improved if we had a better idea of how the population responded as it got closer to that kind of carrying capacity. But certainly, and people who are interested in this, hopefully once this paper comes out, the model is, it's open source. People can model different scenarios. It has a web-based interface. And also people can access the code in R and change it to sort of suit their needs. But I think this is adding to the literature that is really suggesting that birth control programs, sterilization programs are not cost effective when it comes to rabies control if they are taking resources away from rabies control on its own. Okay, so coming back just briefly to some of these other questions around whether animal birth control programs can do these other things like reducing the risk of dog bites or improving dog welfare. Again, they probably can, theoretically at least, but in order to reduce risk of dog bites, there's one main thing that needs to happen, and that is there needs to be a decrease in abundance or density of dogs in a given area. And if these compensatory mechanisms of migration or increased survival reduce that or make it difficult to achieve a reduction in abundance, then you're not going to have a major impact on reducing the risk of dog bites. There may be an argument, and I think it's a valid argument in terms of female behavior. If females are not having litters, females with litters tend to be quite aggressive and quite protective, and maybe if those females are biting disproportionately at a disproportionately higher rate, then maybe simply reducing the number of fertile females in the population may reduce bite risk through that means. So that's probably another parameter that could be considered in this. And then I think the area where animal birth control programs probably have the biggest effect, or there's the most justification for them, is improving dog welfare. And that, as I say, in measuring that in terms of dog days lost to premature death or dog days lived with impaired welfare, if we start to use that as a metric, I think we would see that these ABC programs do improve dog health. But I think it's important to consider one of the biggest contributions to welfare might not be in preventing potential days lost to premature death, but actually in preventing puppies being born at all and preventing premature death in those puppies. And there's still, I think, maybe an ethical argument to be had as to whether that is better for those puppies to never be born or to actually be born and then die within a 6-week period, or have a strong probability of dying in a 6-week period. And then I think we'd need to look at what sort of improvement in welfare there is in these populations with animal birth control programs. And I think the biggest impact there would be improved welfare of sterilized females and potentially of those puppies that are born. If there's fewer puppies being born, maybe there's going to be more resources going around for those puppies that are born, and they will have improved welfare. So I think these are some of the areas where we can kind of consider the value of animal birth control programs. But I really want to emphasize that if we look at it through a lens of cost effectiveness, I think it really calls for more of a decoupling of these programs, animal birth control versus mass dog vaccination for rabies control. Really at the moment, our current thinking is that additional surgical sterilization to rabies control is not cost effective if your primary goal is to reduce dog rabies cases. But as I said in the beginning of the talk, I think we do need to keep in mind the potential for these injectable contraceptives to come online. And so I still think we need to consider these questions so that we can actually make some firm recommendations when the time comes about the adoption of any of these new techniques in rabies control programs. Again, understanding whether or not they'll be cost effective in adding those to rabies control programs. And I think these are the questions that we need to address, the ecological questions. What regulates dog population numbers? How do dog populations respond to a decrease in birth rates? Are there compensatory changes in survival, net migration inwards? And what is the overall effect on abundance? And then I think a question that's important in terms of encouraging development of these contraceptive technologies is there a case to be made for technologies that have a relatively short duration of effect? Because I think people are quite close to developing solutions that would have a 1, maybe 2-year duration of effect. I think there's a big focus on the holy grail of a permanent injectable contraceptive. And I just wonder how necessary that really is. And I think it might be obstructing development of some of these more readily available solutions. So I think that would be an interesting question to address, is what duration of contraception would kind of be long enough given a particular cost in order for it to be cost effective. So hopefully the quantitative ecologists within the group will take these questions on and really run with them. And certainly we've got a lot of the data that might be needed to support some of this. And if we don't have the data, we've certainly got the study sites where we can collect it. So I'd like to thank you very much for the invitation, for the opportunity to talk, and certainly for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. I think we have time for some questions.
I just want there are 2 questions. Firstly is, what is the kind of ownership that we actually see for dogs in? Is it like a fixed ownership, or is it something very loose? Because I think the loose ownership is something that we can identify a lot in India. So when you say own dogs, these are actually owned by households. They take regular care of these dogs in terms of vaccinations and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's a pretty fixed concept in that people will identify that they own a dog, and that dog will be associated with that household, and there will be some level of responsibility towards that dog. It's not necessarily to say that they'll take care of the dog, but they usually provision it with food and shelter in the yard. I mean, just allowing the dog to be around there. Well, it doesn't necessarily mean that they'll get the dog vaccinated. Veterinary care is not that easily accessible, so people won't necessarily pay very much to have that dog, but they will perceive a benefit in having it. So it is a fairly fixed concept, and in fact, the problem that we maybe run into is that dogs might identify with more than one household, but we don't know that because the owners don't actually know that. So the dogs might move around a little bit. And so that's not something we've really teased out. But when we did do some radio tracking of dogs, we did find one situation in a total of 6 dogs where a dog actually had 2 households quite far apart. So we might be double counting when we do this, but it's more of that scenario rather than the scenario that a dog doesn't really identify with any household at all, or multiple households will identify with a dog.
Okay, my second question is, Andrew Yoke in 2015 had published a paper on how basically sterilization in some ways helps in disease control. And he had done that study in Jaipur. So I just want you to comment on that, because I think your study, at least in this particular area, shows a very important, it gives a very important information that surgical sterilization may not be capable of controlling rabies.
Yeah, I think, again, it's a question of cost effectiveness. Where is if we have limited resources, how is it best to spend them? Trying to access more dogs with vaccination, or trying to sterilize dogs? And certainly, if you look at it through that, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that it would be cost effective under the majority of kind of scenarios, realistic scenarios. Your paper, I mean, I did read it, and I think we always have to kind of question some of the assumptions that go into these models. And I think trying to be as explicit as possible. And a lot of that is based on serological data as kind of an indicator of health, which I also wasn't particularly comfortable with, you know. So, you know, I think we need to do more of these sorts of studies, but I also don't think that they should stand in the way of what we already know, which is if you want to control rabies, put your resources into dog vaccination. Anything else is a little bit more nuanced. Thank you.
Given that rabies vaccines are generally quite immunogenic, and I don't know if you've seen it, but then I assume that dogs that have some sort of immunity and are then boosted generally should have enough protective titers for the rest of their lifetime. I mean, even though their lifetimes are for stray dogs are generally quite low. I mean, would it make sense to try to model, if you're modeling something like that, would it make sense to model lifelong immunity once revaccinated? And do you think that could actually change the coverage that you would need if you assume that there's a certain proportion that become immune for life?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think these models, I don't think we've ever really tried to capture the question of revaccination of these individuals. And you know, if you're going back into an area a year later and you're catching dogs, what proportion of those dogs have you likely already kind of vaccinated? So even without trying, what proportion of dogs are you actually providing a booster to? And then the question is whether that's a good or a bad thing. It's probably a question that you can't really do anything about. You don't necessarily want to avoid dogs that you've already vaccinated if it takes a lot of effort to establish whether they're already vaccinated. You just want to vaccinate everything that you can catch. But if you know for a fact that a particular dog has been vaccinated previously, then I think the question is a valid one. Do you go out of your way to vaccinate it, or do you go out of your way to avoid it and put your resources into vaccinating a dog that hasn't been vaccinated before? And I think there's a lot of questions around duration of immunity, and you know, I kind of summarized in that one parameter as the rate of loss of immunity. But you could take a more sophisticated approach to that. But I just don't think we've really got a good handle on duration of immunity from a single versus a booster, and how well our, as we discussed earlier, our antibody titers actually correlate to a truly protective effect against rabies. And it would be not impossible, but quite difficult to really generate that data.
I noticed that the vaccination was on the right side, you know, the dog welfare and the
on this side, yeah. Yeah.
I'm wondering, I mean, why wouldn't it actually be on both sides? Because you would think that a vaccinated dog would be more happier.
Yeah, it's a good question, and that was, as I was kind of developing this framework, I started to, and that's why I explicitly thought about, rather than the prevalence of rabies, the number of rabid dog days, because rabies does that. I mean, it makes dogs sick for a relatively short period of time, but it also causes premature death. So you could actually look at rabies control within that welfare framework. And actually what you really should do is include human DALYs prevented in that. And then you've got a combined, if you're going to take a particular approach, what effect does that have on animal welfare, but also what effect does that have on human health? And it would be fairly easy to kind of model that for a particular reduction in dog rabies cases. You'd get a particular reduction in human DALYs as well as economic costs associated with post-exposure prophylaxis. And I think if you started to put all of that together, your case for rabies control as a global good really becomes more and more kind of robust.
Just one follow-up thing. In terms of other than, I mean, there's a fairly high paper copy mortality, and in my own neighborhood, I mean, for example, I noticed getting run over for both adult dogs as well as for puppies is a big source of mortality. Also, in the case of the recent rains, an entire litter was washed away.
Yeah.
Because they often have litter in drains and gutters.
Yeah.
So in terms of the population that you're looking at, is that is like traffic accidents or other sources?
It was actually very difficult for us to get causes of mortality, even in adult dogs, let alone in those puppies. You know, people don't really worry about their puppies; they're just there, and then one day they're not there. You know, they're either dead or they'll find the body, or the puppy will just have disappeared. And we try to get out there soon enough to do a decent post-mortem, but in those sort of weather conditions, very hot and humid, we never really got anything. So we've been trying over time to get causes of death, but there's nothing that really kind of jumps out. Most owners will report that it's probably an infectious disease or parasites. We did see what I thought were cases of exposure to weather during cold periods, and then just malnutrition, probably the runts and the litters just dying off. Traffic accidents weren't a major cause of death. There's not a lot of vehicle traffic in that area. So I think these things will differ from place to place. But, I mean, keep in mind, this was, at least for the adult population, a fairly well-resourced, well-looked after, relatively speaking, population. And even then, we see these really high levels of puppy mortality.
I have a question on email, so I will ask this in a back to others. India has lost, this is from Chris Bowden, who's with the Royal Society Protection College. He's based here in Bangalore. So he says India has lost 40 million vultures over the past 15 to 20 years. This represents 12 million tons of rotting meat that is no longer consumed by vultures every year, and much of this is potentially available to feral dogs. There is some suggestion that dog populations directly benefited from less vultures in the early 2000s with associated rabies implications. But hard data is hard to come by, and of course it's complex. Do you know of any studies or planned studies to quantify this relationship? Or do you have any suggestions on the links between vulture and feral dog population?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely a question a lot of people have asked related to the vulture decline. And so, no, I'm not aware of any studies that have really addressed that. And it kind of ties into this question of carrying capacity and just trying to understand what regulates dog population. Is it resource availability in terms of food, or do they actually get enough from direct provisioning of people that anything else is maybe a bonus? But even that bonus, 12 million tons is a lot of potential resource. Are you going to see an increase in survival rates or migration rates into those areas? And these are ecological questions, and I think they require fairly comprehensive ecological studies to actually address them. And I wouldn't necessarily be an expert in that, but I think there are ways you could do that, particularly maybe long-term studies where we see vultures returning or vulture numbers coming back, or conversely in areas where there are vultures. I guess you couldn't really exclude vultures from particular areas very well. So there probably are ways of designing experiments around that, but you need to be pretty creative about what you did. But I think it is quite an important question. But I don't have an answer to that. I'm aware of a lot of anecdotal reports that talk about increases in dog populations, but I don't know how rigorous those studies were.
So I was trying to understand how the idea of herd immunity scales with the population density and not abundance. So I guess what I'm asking is what would be a more cost-effective way if you have an area with, let's say, same area with 10 dogs and another area with 20 dogs, what would you target first?
What would you what?
Target first for vaccination?
I don't know the answer to that. Again, probably in terms of cost effectiveness, it would be I'd need to consider that a little bit more, and maybe we can chat about it. I mean, my gut instinct says go for the smaller population and put your resources in there and eliminate rabies or control rabies in that population. At least then it's not a source for when you move on to the larger population. So it's kind of a question of starting with the low-hanging fruit, I guess. So it's easier to get 70% in a small population than in a larger population. I'm sure other people have considered that question in a little bit more detail. So, but that's my gut answer.
This was asking about. I have observed some death of the puppies by the juvenile dogs. In the infights I have seen killing these puppies.
Sorry, say that again.
The juvenile dogs, not the big one. In the infights, they kill the puppies. I have seen some cases.
That's interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that. But yeah, I think the more we study these populations, the more we'll learn. I always find it a little bit ironic. We know a lot more about some of the wildlife populations in the areas around these dog populations than we do about the dog populations themselves, despite the ubiquity of dog populations and their importance from a public health point of view. People don't study their ecology and their habits.
I have a last question. So, one of the things that sort of struck me, and sort of following up from Manvi's question.
So is the mic on there?
Yeah, sorry. Following up from Manvi's question, so rabies is considered not to be density dependent. But surely the rate of contacts between, so your, I suppose, how does contact scale with density when the probability of an individual dog transmitting, so basically, your basic reproductive value should change if if a population has 10 dogs versus if it has 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 dogs. But some of the empirical work suggests that and the modeling work suggests that it doesn't.
Yeah.
Why do you think that it's happening?
Again, I think it's a question of trying to understand dog behavior a little bit better. We spoke about the question of females in heat that are able to attract large numbers of dogs from quite large distances. So that a mechanism like that would overcome any need for kind of density. Depends. You'd get the same rate of contacts in a low versus a high density population. So maybe a mechanism like that is playing a role, or resource availability. So if resources are fairly patchily distributed, when there is a resource available, more dogs kind of come there. I don't know the answer, and it's always kind of surprised me that, because intuitively you think that it would scale with density, but it doesn't seem to. And maybe the scales that we're looking at also play a role. Dogs have pretty small kind of home ranges, but then you do get some individuals with much larger home ranges. So maybe just trying to understand the role that different individuals might actually play in that. At a reduced density, a particular dog might still compensate for that by increasing home range size or whatever the case may be. So I think there are some interesting questions to address, again, from an ecological perspective, to understand dog behavior and dog spatial movements a little bit better.
Yeah, I just thought of, given how it might be difficult to actually target stray dog populations, what are your thoughts on the use of oral vaccines? What are your thoughts on the use of oral rabies vaccines for rabies control? Yeah,
I mean, again, that's a question that always comes up. And again, it's going to be a question of cost effectiveness. We've looked at that in Africa, and it's pretty much been found not to be cost effective because we are able to access a sufficient proportion of the population through with traditional vaccines. And the advantage then is if you're able to handle a dog and inject it, then there's a pretty good chance that that dog is immunized. Obviously, oral rabies vaccines are, at least when we were doing the work, a little bit more costly per dose than the injectable. But of course, it's not a question of one dose per dog with the oral vaccine. I mean, you look at what they spend on oral rabies vaccination in the States, for example, trying to target raccoons. They drop thousands of baits, and I don't know what the rate is of baits per individual vaccinated, but I'm sure it's pretty high, and that obviously really adds to the cost of a program like that. So I can't easily imagine a scenario under which it would be cost effective to look at oral rabies vaccination in a dog population, and maybe just again worth putting more effort and resources into catching and vaccinating a higher proportion of your population.
Okay, great. Thank you everyone for coming and for engaging in this discussion, and thank you very much, Darren, for that wonderful talk. And we look forward to continuing this conversation.
Yep. Thank you, everyone.